Hello everybody. So today I'm going to talk about a bit of a sensitive topic, which is talking about a male childcare worker here in Australia, in Melbourne, who has had his name and photos of him shown all over the media based on suspicion that he may have committed child sexual abuse whilst working as a childcare worker in the last, I think it was 3 or 4 years. Now, I wanted to make a few comments about this. So the first one is that I won't just say it's unusual, I thought it was illegal to put somebody's name or any identifying marks, let alone a full set of photos of them, when they haven't even been found guilty before. In fact, it's usually illegal, as far as I'm aware, even when they are found guilty, because there's ordinarily an automatic suppression order in place. So what is going, and the reason why they have that, by the way, is that because a lot of people do get in a bit of an uproar about it, and there's a lot of cases where people are found not guilty, and just because they had their name, their identity, their photos, all that shown, it ruins their lives, even though they're found guilty. Now, in cases with celebrities, they kind of can't avoid that. So you have a case like, for example, Michael Jackson. He was found not guilty, but I wouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people think that he was a pedophile in spite of being found not guilty. Now, that's objectively unfair, but a lot of people think it's fair enough, because they view that in spite of being found not guilty, he was still not guilty. Now, I didn't really follow that case completely, but it seems to me reasonably unlikely that that was the case. I can't say that definitively, but I'd say generally speaking that's probably not the case. A lot of people think that the law just caters for the rich and all that, and that's not really how it works. So what actually happens in a legal situation, if you are so poor that you can't afford a lawyer and you have a public defender, and the other side has a full-on big-time barrister or a team of barristers, then you can get unfair decisions against you. Or if you represent yourself, for example. And unless you are someone that knows what you're doing, representing yourself is usually a way to lose a case that you should have won. So you do get that kind of disparity. But in cases where it's a rich person defending themselves, you actually get a sense of justice. And yeah, you have to have a certain degree of wealth to guarantee that justice. But it's not, you don't get injustice because of that. You don't get a case where they're going to get a corrupt or false decision. It's not really how it works. But anyway, I've gone a bit off tangent. I mean, they do get a better sense of justice, that's true. But I mean, it's more that they will win if they were supposed to win. It's still not going, no amount of money will let you win if you are clearly guilty. If you are not no matter how many votes. So anyway, so to get to this case of this guy, so ordinarily, he's not a celebrity. You would not have his face, his images, his identity would not be allowed to be shown. There'd be a suppression order. Now we don't know, well we sort of do know, but we don't. A lot of people aren't thinking about why this might be the case that his identity is being shown. We're not thinking about that, and we should be thinking about that. So I'm going to explain why they might be doing that, and sort of they've kind of already told us. So what they've actually said is that they're releasing his identity because we're not just talking about touching, we're talking about full-on sexual assault. And in that case, they are fearing that there might be people with sexually transmitted diseases, children. And they could be, I think it was as young as 5 months, or possibly 8 months old, which is extraordinarily young for that kind of offence. Normally the youngest that you get for that kind of offence is like 5 or 6, and even that's really young. I mean, 9 or 10 would be the youngest that you'd normally get. So less than a year old is insanely young. That could do serious long-term damage, and you'd think that would, your parents would know if that had happened. You wouldn't be able to hide that. But that's their justification for it. That's the thing. Like, there's a certain age where it's just going to, I'm not sure what the cutoff is, but there's a certain age, a certain size, whatever, where if you have sex at that age, and it's obviously not going to be consensual, that it can mean you'll never be able to have children as an adult, like, for your life. And it can give you serious organ damage and all sorts of other things that are well beyond the amount of damage you would get if that happened to you as an adult. So while we think, well, it happening as an adult is awful, there is a damage level that can be a lot higher amongst children. And I find it difficult to believe that someone could have that happen. Maybe they don't know who did it, but they would know that it had happened. It's really quite extraordinary to believe that there could be multiple people out there who could have children at that age and not be aware that it had happened to them, particularly by a stranger. And we're talking about a childcare worker. We're not talking about a parent or a cousin or a brother or a sister or an uncle or whoever. We're talking about a childcare worker. So that's a big red flag for me. Now, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but it does not make normal sense with what we know normally happens. This is not normal. This is not what normally happens in this kind of case. It's not what you expect. It's not what you think, okay, that's within the realms of possibility. No, this is insane. Now, but that's the justification. It's because they're convinced that he might have done that. Now, that tells me, so that's the justification for breaching what would normally be a suppression order. And this breach has come from police, so nothing illegal there. But that tells me that they're doing this under false pretext, because the chances of him doing that to multiple children, I mean, it could happen. Obviously, there have been assaults to children that young, that has happened. But when it's happened, the parents would be acutely aware of it. And they might not know what's caused it, but they would be aware of there being severe damage to their baby. You know, like, I mean, it would be different damage if it was a boy or a girl, but either way, it would be severe, long-term, very likely to be permanent damage. That it's just insanely bad. You know, this sort of damage is not the kind of thing that you wouldn't be aware of. You would be very much aware. And so they're saying that you need to get an STD test done for the children if they're under his care. Now, I'm aware that yes, there are different levels of parenting skill. But for you to be a parent and not be aware that has happened to your child, I don't even know where to begin what that says about you as a parent. That you would not be aware that your child, your baby, has their whole body ripped in half. Because that's essentially what we're talking about, with permanent, or at the very minimum, very long-term damage, very serious damage, and you're not aware of that. Now, I know there are parents that, for whatever reason, they're not aware, or maybe they think it's something else, but that baby would come back screaming constantly, and you'd have to take him to the doctor. And you would. Any parent would take their child to a doctor if it was anything like that. So the idea that this is justified by an STD doesn't ring true to me. That tells me, yes, that's their official justification, that's what they've said, but that tells me that something else is going on here. Because, yes, the ones that happen to, they do have to get an STD check, but I'm assuming that these are parents. Let's say he did it to 2 or 3. I can believe that. 2 or 3, they're babies, they've come, or maybe they weren't babies, maybe they were 6 or 7 year olds. And their parents have come in and said, this has happened, their bodies are absolutely destroyed. It's a horrific thing to do. And they've come forward, they've accused this man of doing this. And then the police have said, well, one of you's got an STD, maybe even 2 or 3 of them. Let's just assume all of them have. It's an overreaction. You see, and even though he may have worked with kids as young as 5 or 6 months, it's much more likely that he'd do it to an older kid because you could get away with it more. Because, okay, you can get away with it as far as they're not going to talk back when they're a baby, but the damage is going to be so insane that the parents are going to just be, they're going to take them straight to a paediatrician, going to get specialist care, they're going to look into that, and they're going to be asking a lot of questions. They might not necessarily straight away know it was this, particularly if you've got children that can't talk yet or can't talk very well. But yeah, it's, the odds of it being babies is very low. That's not statistically the likely thing. And also, people that do this, they do tend to have an age preference. And if that age preference is 7, or that age preference is 10, or that age preference is 3, they're all going to be about the same age. They don't tend to have a range that big. It's not really what happens. I mean, maybe if you can't get the one that you prefer, you get one that you don't prefer, but, so if you've got, and I suppose it wouldn't be a 6-year-old if it's in childcare, but let's say it was a 4-year-old, and then you go back and you say, oh, well, therefore it must be 5 months old. Well, no. Anyway, so I think that was a massive overreaction by police. Probably. We don't know all the details, but it sounds like it was a massive overreaction and the wrong reaction. And that we shouldn't have had his name or identity or photos shown in the media now. They could have quietly contacted people. And the reason not to, it's not to protect him. It's not to protect him. He's been charged. He's probably in jail now. I'd say he's definitely in jail. And if they have anywhere near the amount of evidence that it sounds like they do, he's going to go to jail. He's going to stay in jail possibly for life, or for a very long time at least. And that's not going to make any difference between whether they say this to the public or not. So them going to the public it's not helping them convict him. In fact, the opposite is true, because he could go to court and argue that there's been unfair prejudice against him. He can't get a fair jury trial because everybody knows about it. And he could be potentially found not guilty in spite of being guilty because of the unfairness about it. So do you want that? It's essentially giving him a path to get off, to get away with it. And that's assuming he is guilty. So, big problem there. And not only that, what if he actually is not guilty? Now, obviously, they've gone to this level, you'd hope that he's guilty, and it sounds like he probably is, but there are certainly a lot of cases of people that are accused of this kind of thing and are not guilty at all. This is probably not the sort of circumstance where it'd be likely to be false, but when they are not guilty, and if you've put their name through the mud, it ruins their lives. So I'd say if he's not guilty, it's going to ruin his life. And if he is guilty, he goes to jail. Is he going to be murdered in jail? I mean, he's already probably in jail in a holding cell. If you didn't say his identity, he could probably just have a prison term. Yeah, effectively, they're giving him a death sentence now because of this. So if he's found guilty, he's going to be getting a death sentence. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's fair enough. If you've ripped people's bodies apart and destroyed their lives for life, they're never going to recover. Which is what this does if you do that to a baby, or it often does. Not guaranteed, obviously. But, if you do that, a lot of people would say you should get the death penalty for that. And, fair enough. But in Australia, we don't have the death penalty. But they're essentially giving him the death penalty over this. If he goes to jail, if he goes into open jail, presumably he's in a holding cell right now, probably by himself. Not in solitary confinement, but just in a single cell, I'd imagine. And some kind of remand centre. But I've got some near me. They might be in one of the ones near me. But if he goes into the general population, as they call it, he would presumably be killed pretty quickly. Which would mean that he'd have to be held in solitary confinement. You can't do that for too long, or else they go crazy, and that's unfair on them. So they've created a whole heap of issues for his fair treatment. And it's horrendous that they've done this on the justification of, we need to get some kids to get STDs checked. They could have done it in a quieter way. They could have checked with the childcare centres and checked with different names and things. They didn't have to make a public outcry. They could have sent letters off. Now sure, the letters would have been disturbing for people, but they didn't have to say somebody's name and identity. They could have said the name and identity of the people who'd sent children to the childcare centres and got that tested that way, if they thought that was a concern. So there is an issue there. That's a big issue. Now, there is also a second man who they've accused. Now, the second man was not a childcare worker from what I can tell, but he knew this man. We're not sure if they were friends or what the situation is, but this other person was doing much more serious things and much worse. But he wasn't a childcare worker. And it seems like that may be connected. We're not quite sure. We don't really know that much about him. Now, I've also seen on Twitter, called X now, that apparently this man was gay, a childcare worker. Okay, so they had a picture of his boyfriend. So a lot of people have said, well, because he's gay, and he did this, therefore, gay people shouldn't be allowed children. Now, I want to note, now I don't have the actual statistics in front of me, but from my experience, the vast majority of men that worked in childcare centres were gay. Alright? Now, I do have one statistic, which is that 96% of childcare workers are women. And the 4% that are men, from my observations, around 90% of them are gay. Now, I don't exactly know why most of them are gay, but they just are. Now, for men that do work in childcare centres, and I did work in them for not really a couple of years, like a couple of months, it is really terrible for a man to be working in a childcare centre. You get extraordinary levels of discrimination. Now, you don't get it from your fellow workers, or even really from the kids, but you get it from the parents, particularly the single mothers. The single mothers come to drop off their kids and they see a man there, then they start abusing him. And it becomes so awful that you don't want to work there. So, you know, I did that very early in my adult life, and I very quickly stopped doing it because of the extreme level of bullying and discrimination. Now, the gay men that were working there didn't face that discrimination. Or they didn't appear to be, at least. Maybe they did, but they seem to be coping a lot better with it. Now, I could also note that most hairdressers are female. The ones that are male are mostly gay. Why is that? I'd suggest that they probably face similar levels of discrimination. And until fairly recently, most nurses were female. Now, I'd still say the majority are female, but there's more men. But there was a long time where if you were a male nurse, you would get discriminated against. So, why is this? And is this a problem? Now, we do have male-dominated jobs. For example, I worked for a seafood company for a couple of days, just a little temp job, and they said that effectively women are banned from that sort of workplace because women are only allowed to carry, I think it was 10 kilos, and men are allowed to take 20. And they said, well, since all fish are 20 kilos, we can't hire any women. So the actual union that said, no, we're not going to allow any women carrying more than 10 kilos, even though some are big women, and they could. That effectively banned them. And if you work in, let's say you're a bricklayer or in most trades, you'd probably face severe discrimination being a woman. And in female-dominated areas, men face discrimination as well for being male. And now I'd say high school's about 50-50. Primary school is mostly women. Childcare is almost all women. So the level of discrimination you face in childcare is a lot higher than you face in primary school, which in turn is a lot worse than in high school. You don't really face any in high school. I've actually worked in high school, didn't face any discrimination. Didn't face much in primary school, but a little bit. And faced a lot in childcare centres. So why would a man want to work in a childcare centre? Obviously only 4% do, so that's 25 to 1. And obviously there is a massive social stigma against doing it. But why would men want to? Well, the reason is that most childcare centres want men to work there. And in fact, this is because of a quite well-known psychological issue, which is that when you have single-parent families, you can have children grow up in an unbalanced way. So essentially, for the first, I think it's 6 months of life, both boys and girls need their mother. And from about 6 months to 18 months, they start to drift off to the same sex that they are. So girls will need their mother, boys will need their father. And then from about 18 months to about 4, they both girls and boys will need their father. Maybe it's 3. I don't know exactly the thing. And then after that, then it depends on the individual. So some girls will want their mother more, some will want their father. Some boys will want their mother more, some boys will want their father. So there's different ages and different stages. And fathers provide a different role in a family to what mothers do. Now, we know every individual is different, and not all women that are mothers provide traditional mother roles, and sometimes it's the other way around and so forth. But we find that if it's a single parent family, that children can grow up unbalanced. And this is also the case if you have 2 women raising a child, although sometimes, and this is often the case in lesbian relationships, one takes on more of the male role. And same with gay men in a relationship, some will take more of the female role. So maybe that's okay, but it's still, without the actual opposite sex, it can become imbalanced. And it doesn't affect children in the same way for each child, but it can cause them to become quite confused. So yes, in some cases that'll mean that they'll become pedophiles, and in some cases they'll become strippers and sex workers and do drugs and go into organised crime and all sorts of things. But other cases they don't do that. It's not a guarantee of what they're going to do, but it is a guarantee that they're going to have trouble fitting in. Now, that's not to say that just because you've got a mother and father in your house the whole time, that means you're guaranteed to have a good upbringing. So there can be abuse even in that situation. It can be terrible, but the chances are that that's going to be overall more likely to be a more stable environment, and we know this. So when you have a childcare centre, they're only looking after the kids for a small amount of time, and it depends on the family. Some families leave their kids 1 day a week, some only for a few hours on that 1 day a week, and others leave them all day, every day, for 5 days. And the ones that leave them all day, every day, tend to be single mothers. They usually will get discount so that they will get the childcare either free or cheaper, and then they will spend all their day working because they need to afford it. In that situation, they only have one woman at home. They desperately need to have a man in what they're doing the rest of the time, which is the childcare centre. And if they don't, they become very imbalanced. Now, arguably, it doesn't matter for the first 6 months. You need your mother anyway. And for girls, it doesn't matter for a bit longer because they're going to need their mother anyway. But there's a period there where they're going to need to have a male role model. Where's it going to come from? I mean, if she's got a boyfriend, if a single mother's got a boyfriend, fine. She's got a brother, fine. She's got a father, fine. But what if she doesn't? And there are a lot of cases where they don't. And they rely on the childcare centre to give them that balance. And if the childcare centre is all women, as a lot of them are, most of them I'd say are, then it can be a problem. Even having just one male there can give that positive male role model. Now, you obviously don't want to have a pedophile working for you, but the push to have men working in childcare centres comes from childcare centres, it comes from psychologists, it comes from people that understand children's upbringing. It's not aimed to have children be exposed to pedophiles. It's aimed to do that. Now, the other thing I wanted to note is there were some claims to just ban all men, and they claim that almost all child sex abuse is by men. I'd say that's probably the opposite way around. And I mean, when you have statistics about these things, they can be very heavily manipulated. And I mean, a lot of crime statistics are not really accurate. So I'll just say, there is, if you look at domestic violence, for example, most people think, they're just thinking, it's always men against women. Women never hurt men. The majority are men against women. It's 3-1. So why is it 3-1 and why is it not 100-0? Because this is the thing, it's not all about physical force. Some women are stronger than some men. And in fact, the women that tend to be fairly big, either tall or just big, tend to go with men that tend to be pretty small. So if you get, let's say you're 6'2", you're a woman who's 6 foot tall, you're not probably going to want to go with your average 5'10" guy. You're going to go for a short guy, 5'2", 5'4", and your gender roles will swap. And in those situations, now obviously domestic violence is not the norm, but you're more likely to have domestic violence by the woman. And there's also situations where men are trying to be good people and they're afraid of doing the wrong thing. Women are not afraid. So that can be that as well. But it's also actually underreported, and some statistics suggest that actually it's women committing domestic violence more often than men, but our social stigma leads to severe underreporting by men, overreporting by women. Women are getting believed a lot more, and so forth. I mean, there's a number of cases, like thousands of cases, where men have reported domestic violence by their female partner, and the man was arrested and the woman was allowed to stay there, in spite of evidence that the woman did the violent act. Because our criminal justice system is extraordinarily heavily biased in favour of women and against men. Now, I know some people will say, oh, you're just lying, you're just a man. Let's just be a bit realistic here. Prisons have 11 times as many men as women in them. There's many case studies of this, where you will have a man do the same crime as the woman. He's more likely to be convicted and more likely to get a longer sentence than the woman. In fact, there are cases where there'll be a group of men and women do the same crime, for example, a bank robbery. Men get convicted more than the woman, and they get longer sentences. And it's significantly longer, significantly more likely to be convicted. So there's extraordinary bias. So whenever we look at these statistics, we have to take that 11-1 bias, because most people would realise you being a man or you being a woman does not inherently make you a good person or a bad person. Individuals are good people, individuals are bad people. It's not your gender that defines that. So we need to take gender-based statistics or crime statistics with a massive grain of salt. And, you know, I've seen a number of studies that have seen that, for example, in foster care, it's much more likely for the child abuse to be done by the foster mother than the foster father. And there's a logical reason for this. If you look at children tend to be pretty small. Now, obviously, after a certain age, they might be able to compete with some very small adults. I'd say once they start going through puberty, so 12 or 13, there are some individual children who can compete physically with adults. And obviously by 15, by 16, there's a larger number of them. But if you're talking about a 6-year-old child, or a 10-year-old child, a 4-year-old child, they're not going to be able to compete with even very small, even very weak adults. And a lot of women will take advantage of that. And they will commit violence or abuse of different kinds against the children, knowing that the criminal justice system favours them, they're going to get away with it, and knowing also that they have physical superiority over the children. If you think of who beats you as a child, and we look through this historically, yes, men would hit their kids with a belt, and the woman would hit them with the shoe. And this is a bit of a traditional thing. Who would do most of the beating? The woman, not the man. The man might do the more severe beating, and in some households the man would do more. But overall, more commonly, it was the woman. The mother was the one that would do the physical abuse. The physical discipline, because that's not abuse. The physical discipline to the children. So there is a historical basis for this. And so we know that most child abuse is by women, not by men. We know that just based on logic. We look at the statistics and say, well, it's mostly women. There's mostly men that do it. Oh, it's all men. All men. Not mostly, but all. Not a 3-to-1. You know, they were trying to convince us that all domestic violence was by men against women, but we find it's 3-to-1. Oh, but it's all. 3-to-1's all. May as well be. But it's not. And then if you insert the bias against men and in favour of women, it's probably actually more women than men. And so we got to understand that when we're looking at this. And I look at this case, I'm hoping that he's guilty, because if he's not, this was a massive miscarriage of justice to have his name and his identity out there. But if he is guilty, he might get off because they've exposed this, and that's inherently unfair. And not only that, if he is found guilty, and he was guilty, and this was a fair thing to do, he's probably going to get killed in prison. And if he's not killed in prison, they're going to have extra precautions for it. So there's no scenario in which this was a good idea. There's no way of looking at this that this was a good idea. Because it gets people excited, gets them calling for things like, oh, why would you ever want to work in childcare as a man? Oh, you want to do it to play around with kids? You know, that's just an insane, stupid thing to suggest. Many are suggesting that Wiggles are all guilty of crimes because they were male children's entertainers. You're saying, I mean, there's all these people. Are you going to say all of them, without exception, all of them are terrible? If they were male, dealing with children, they're therefore bad. All the males on play schools should be banned. So you're saying, I mean, if we do go ahead with this ban, we're going to go further and say, well, we're not allowed to have any male children's entertainers. Sorry, no parties where you're allowed to have men working there. So whenever you have a children's party at McDonald's or whatever it might be, you're going to have female only because men are banned. And what's going to keep going from that is you're going to end up having women only household, or the men will be allowed to have the baby, but then they're going to be kicked out. They're going to have to live separately. And it keeps going, and you'll have really poorly adjusted children. And there'll come a point where you'll realise this was a bad move. Now, there is a way to limit this, and I'll tell you, most childcare centres, and again, I had a small amount of work experience with them, they would have security set up so that you can't do this sort of thing. So you'd have 2 people looking at you at all times, as 2 other workers looking at you. So it shouldn't even be possible to do this, not at the childcare centre. A childcare worker could do it somewhere else, if they take the kids home or whatever, but not at the actual childcare centre. It shouldn't be possible. In fact, there's already laws in place about that, and they've said on TV that it's about having more childcare centres comply with those laws. Now, maybe they did comply, and maybe this is all a load of nonsense and he didn't do anything. We don't know at this stage. But the other thing is, if they want to have a bit of a higher level, they talked about him taking photos or videos of the kids. Well, ban phones. There's no real reason to have someone with a phone out when they're looking after kids. I mean, when I worked at top secret places, and they would very rarely allow phones. You put your phone in a locker, you go and do your work. When you finish your shift, you take your phone out. You'd also take your phone out at lunch, as long as you left the premises. Or if you were in a secure area where there was none of that stuff around, you might be allowed to take your phone in there. But it was under controlled conditions. And this is because, to get a job in a top secret place, you need to go through rigorous amounts of vetting. But you still have people that will do the wrong thing. So in the same sense, if you have people that do the wrong thing in top secret places, you're going to have people that do the wrong thing in this sort of place as well. So just simply ban the phone. Now that's not going to stop everything, but it should be a part of it. I absolutely think they should ban the phone. Maybe let managers have it, because hopefully they're a bit more safer. But why do you need the phone? Oh, you might be getting an emergency call coming in. Well, okay, you get an emergency call, you get them to call the centre. They normally have a normal wall phone, you know, a landline, and if you absolutely need it to have on your phone, then you get your manager to look at it. We get them to send you a message and you look at it in your break. You know, there's ways around this that don't endanger the children. And they shouldn't be simply worried about men. This is a very sexist, very inaccurate way to look at it. And look, this is not worrying because, oh no, somebody did this. We don't know whether they did it. If he did do it, it's worrying, yes, absolutely. But I think a lot of people are missing the big picture, that if they are panicking over this, and the amount of panic just shows why this is normally kept secret. It shows why we don't normally just show off people's names and addresses and details when they're first accused of something like this. You don't. No, you can for murder. I mean, this is the thing. I've been talking about the mushroom trial with Erin Patterson. If she's found not guilty, yeah, there'll be people that will still think that she's guilty, but it's not going to be the same level of stigma as if she was accused of a sexual crime. The level of stigma is different. She goes to jail, people are going to look at her. In fact, murderers, when they go to jail, actually get treated really well. So she'll probably actually get a lot of respect. People will go, oh yeah, hey, oh yeah, and all that sort of stuff. Now it might be a bit of a problem because they're elderly and all that, but she'd probably be okay in prison. Very different situation. So it's okay to say her name. I don't have any problem whatsoever with saying a murderer or accused murderer's name. I personally don't like to say it very much. I think that's, I just don't feel good about saying people's names. But, if a sexual thing, you really shouldn't be saying their names. In fact, even if they're found guilty, I still don't think you should be unless there's a very good reason for it. Now, I do understand they want to get the STDs checks. There was a way around that, a different way to do this. It's not like, if this was somebody on the loose, oh yeah, for sure, show their identity as much as you can. But he's not on the loose, he's in custody, he's in prison. He's not going to hurt anybody else. So, yeah, there's massive numbers of problems with this, and I think we'll probably find, when the dust settles, that there will be a lot of people in trouble for releasing his name, his identity, his photo, and all of that. And I think they'll try to reverse a lot of that as much as they can. And if we are stupid enough to go ahead with a ban on men in childcare centres, I think that'll have significant, very negative long-term consequences. We may as well not have childcare centres if that's the case. We should be encouraging more men in childcare centres, not less, and certainly not ban them. Blame all men. All men are guilty. This is big F feminism rhetoric. This is not accuracy. It's like you see these things on TV. They say, oh, Me Too. Oh, Me Too's only for women. Did you know Me Too's only for women? It's only for women that are victims. Men can't be victims, they're men. Men are necessarily perpetrators. Even if they have done nothing, they are always perpetrators. This is what the big F feminism movement is all about. It's about making men evil, making them appear to be evil, and then in retaliation they're supposed to be evil. And this is a massive problem. Anyone that's buying into this, you shouldn't be, you've got to stop. This is a very big problem. So by all means, hate the person or the individual, if he's done it. And again, I'm going to wait until I see a bit more evidence, because I know that there are certainly a lot of cases where people are accused of things like this, even making a big deal about it, and then they're not guilty. I even look at the mushroom trial. 100% of the media think that she's guilty, and yet if you look at the evidence, there's no possibility that she is. And I think we need to be aware that sometimes we make these wild accusations and then it turns out not being true. Puff Daddy's case was another one. Almost everybody thought he was guilty. I wasn't really following it, so I can't really comment, but he was found not guilty of most of the cases. He was found guilty of one thing, from what I understand, he'll get about a 2 or 3 year prison sentence. But it might be less than that, it might be more, it might be time served, but certainly not the level that most people in the media were saying. There was one about someone called Karen Reid. Most people thought she was guilty. Found not guilty. She wasn't even a celebrity. So if you're thinking, oh, they buy their freedom by being a celebrity, well, how could she have? So we do get these things wrong quite a lot, and media are known to lie and exaggerate and manipulate things. And also, I know this first came out for this guy from police. Police aren't lawyers. I know you can get police lawyers, but just because police say that they haven't said he's guilty. In fact, they've said several times, they said, oh, he hasn't pled guilty. I don't believe he's made a plea. He hasn't entered a plea. So, who knows? Maybe he'll plead guilty. But again, sometimes people plead guilty, but they're not guilty because they just want to get a lesser sentence. There's a lot of issues with this. And it's not to do with how bad he was for doing this. I mean, I find it unbelievable that he could have done this as a childcare worker in a childcare centre this many times and not be noticed for several years. I can believe there could be a childcare centre that's completely not following the rules and might have somebody who's in there who's snuck in through all the checks, and there's a lot of checks, by the way, to get to become a childcare worker. Or maybe he was okay at the time and then became bad after he got the job. Who knows? Maybe somebody manipulated him, he changed his views, who knows? But I can believe that one childcare centre could be so lax as to allow it, and that it happened once, maybe even a few times in the same centre. But we're talking about 20 different centres over a 3 or 4 year period. No, it's not really believable. What I think probably happened is that they probably had 2 people, maybe 3, that came forward from different childcare centres. Maybe there were 2 different childcare centres, 3 kids from 2 different childcare centres, and then they just said, well, it must have happened at all of them. Which is pretty irresponsible, really, if you think about it, but I suppose they're just making sure. So I don't think he did it at all 20 childcare centres, and I don't think it was kids as young as 5 months that he was having full-on sex with. I think it was probably 3 or 4 year olds, which is still horrendous. That's horrific. But there's a big difference between 3 or 4 years old and 5 or 6 months old. The younger, the worse. And I'm going to say it was probably older kids, and it was probably only 2 or 3. And it might have been all at one centre. I'm going to say it was at 2 centres, and that's what they have accusations of. I'm sure it's accusations enough to arrest him. And then maybe 1 or even 2 of them had STDs. So, yeah, I think this was the wrong call. It was the wrong call to say his name, to show his photo. And it's even the wrong call to show his photo with another man there, proving that he's gay. There's a lot of homophobia that's come in from this. And the reality is that most men that work in childcare centres are gay. So, what the hell? Is this going to be an anti-gay thing as well? And there are a lot of people that are treating it like that. We're going to stop gay men in there. Well, what about if you're trans? If they stop all men, then you'll have trans women coming. And, maybe that's worse. There's huge numbers of problems in this. I don't think we should be banning all men, but I also think that we should be stopping phones going into childcare centres. If it's not, I thought it was already banned, so definitely should be stopping that. But yeah, maybe they need a bit of an overhaul on it. But if the end result is we're banning all men, I think that's a big problem. It's a long-term shooting ourselves in the feet to solve. I'm not saying it's minor if you've got 2 or 3 victims. There may well be 3 victims, and there may well be more than 3. But I'm not saying it's 170 or whatever they're saying now. I think that's unbelievable. But there have been cases of childcare workers that have committed offences against more than 100 people, but they were all women. I'm not aware of a man ever doing it. So, and to have full-on sex is unbelievable. It's just literally unbelievable. And the women that did it were senior managers that had the authority to get away with stuff. You know, this is a guy that's a temp worker. He's just whipping around different ones at different times. He wouldn't have the ability to do this. I'm shocked that he has the ability to do it even once. I wouldn't have thought he would, but they'd have to have lax security to do it. Anyway, yeah, it's a horrifying situation, and it's being handled very badly by the police and by the media, from what I can tell. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye now.